They said the house of Ashmere would outlive them all, the masters, the servants, even time itself. But that was before one woman found what was buried beneath its silence. Her name was Annabelle, a slave, a shadow in linen, a ghost that moved between the rooms unseen. For years, she washed the floors where her master spilled his wine, carried his wife's tears to the grave, and whispered her prayers into corners where no god would listen. But one night, while the house slept beneath the weight of a storm, Annabelle found the thing that should never have been found. A sealed box hidden behind a false wall in the master's study inside. Letters of shame, a lock of hair, and the proof of a sin so deep it could ruin the Warfield name forever. From that night, the master's sleep grew shorter and his breath heavier. He thought it was guilt. It wasn't. It was her. She began with whispers, then letters, then silence, a silence sharper than any scream. The kind of silence that makes a man question which sounds are real and which belong to the ghosts he's created. And by the time the family realized who truly ruled Ashmere, the keys, the papers, and the master himself were already in her hands. They said no one escapes their chains. But Annabelle did more than escape. She made the chains hers.
The rain had been falling for 3 days without rest. Ashmere Estate sank deeper into mud and shadow, its chimneys breathing smoke like the lungs of something dying. Inside, servants moved quietly through the halls, their whispers swallowed by thunder. Some prayed for the storm to end. Annabelle did not pray anymore. She listened. She knew every sound this house could make: the click of the front latch, the groan of the kitchen floorboards, the low hum that came when wind pressed against the stained glass window of the study. She could tell which door the master used by the way the hinges sighed. She had learned the rhythm of captivity, the way some people learn music. On the 3rd night of rain, the mistress of the house died. No one called for a priest. No one called for mercy. Caleb Warfield stood by the bed with a face carved out of stone. When the doctor left, he ordered the servants to dig a grave near the orchard. Annabelle held the lantern while they worked, the mud sucking at their ankles, the rain washing soil into the open earth. The lantern light trembled across her hands like restless ghosts. When the body was lowered, Caleb turned away and poured whiskey onto the ground, whispering something that sounded less like farewell and more like a curse. Then he walked back to the house, leaving the servants in darkness. Annabelle stayed long after the others were gone, staring at the mound until the rain flattened it smooth. For the first time, she felt that the house was listening to her too. That night, the storm clawed at the windows. Lightning flashed across the hallway and showed her reflection in the mirror. Wet hair, torn dress, eyes that had forgotten fear. Something inside her shifted. She followed the light down the corridor toward the master's study. The door was unlocked. The air inside smelled of tobacco and damp paper. Books leaned against each other like drunk men. On the desk, half-burned candles dripped wax over unopened letters. Annabelle closed the door behind her. She had been here many times before, but only to dust, never to look. Now she looked at everything. She touched the chair where Caleb sat each night, mapping his empire on paper, while his real kingdom rotted outside. She touched the drawer that always stayed locked, the one she had seen him guard like a weapon. Her fingers traced the edges until they felt a tremor in the wood, a draft. She pressed against the panel behind the desk, and it gave way with a sigh, a hollow space. A box wrapped in oilcloth, sealed with wax that bore the family crest. The wax was old and cracked, the color of dried blood. Annabelle held it close to the candlelight. Her reflection danced across its surface like a stranger trapped inside. She hesitated only once. Then she broke the seal. Inside lay a small collection of letters bound by a ribbon faded to brown. The first began with the words, "To my dearest sister." Her breath caught. She read every line, each sentence worse than the last. The letters told of a love that had crossed blood and decency, a secret child hidden from the world, a sin buried beneath money and silence. The handwriting was Caleb's. At the bottom, a name was scratched out with violent strokes. Beneath the bundle lay a tiny carved wooden horse, its tail broken off, its eyes painted blue. A child's toy. Annabelle felt her stomach twist. The toy was clean, too clean, as if it had been wiped of memory. In the corner of the box lay receipts, a sale of property, the transfer of one servant, dated the same month as the last letter. She understood then that someone had been sold to keep the secret. Someone like her. Thunder broke the silence. She dropped the papers and pressed her hand to her mouth, not out of fear but revelation. Every empire hides its foundation of bones, she thought. And now she held the map. She returned the papers to the box, but not in the same order. One letter she kept, folding it into the lining of her dress. Then she placed the box back behind the panel and closed it softly. The candle flickered, throwing her shadow across the wall. Taller now, larger than the desk, larger than fear itself. By morning, the mistress's funeral was over. The guests left before the rain returned. Caleb stayed inside, refusing food, refusing light. Annabelle served him tea without a word. He did not look at her. He did not see the letter she had already copied. Her ink strokes perfect, the signature exact. Days passed. Caleb drank more. At night he muttered names to the dark. Sometimes he called for his sister. Sometimes he called for God. Neither answered. Annabelle worked quietly, always nearby. She cleaned the study again, opened drawers, rearranged papers just enough that he began to doubt his memory. Once she left a folded scrap of ribbon on his desk, the same color as the one in the box. When he found it, he went pale and tore the room apart, looking for the source. She watched from the hallway, unseen. The sound of his rage was music. The next morning he demanded that all servants be searched. No one found anything. He fired 2 men anyway. Annabelle said nothing. When he finally looked at her, his eyes were cracked glass. "You," he said softly, "you've been here longest. You'd tell me if someone was trying to harm me." She met his stare and lowered her head in submission. "Yes, master," she whispered. Her voice was calm as a prayer, but her heart beat like a drum of war. That night she wrote her first letter. No signature, no demand. Just words. "We both remember what the house forgets." She left it in his study, folded beneath his glass of whiskey. When he found it the next morning, he stopped breathing for almost half a minute. From that day, the storm outside seemed to move inside. Doors slammed through windows were shut. Caleb spoke to himself, then stopped speaking at all. He burned papers, tore curtains, locked himself in the cellar for hours. Each night, Annabelle placed a small sign, a scrap of linen, a fragment of wood, something that only he would recognize. Each morning he found it and trembled. He never knew that the footsteps in the hall were hers. Weeks turned into months. Rumors crawled beyond the walls of Ashmere. Relatives whispered that Caleb was losing his mind, that the ghost of his wife had cursed him. Annabelle listened to every rumor like a harvest of seeds. Each one grew exactly where she wanted. One evening he called her into the study. The fire was low, his hands unsteady. "Annabelle," he said, "someone is writing to me. They know things that no one should know." She tilted her head. "Perhaps you should tell them the truth, sir." His eyes narrowed. "And what truth is that?" She smiled faintly. "The kind that keeps men awake." He slapped the desk. The sound echoed through the hall. For a moment she thought he might strike her, but his hand dropped to his side, trembling. "You don't know what you're talking about," he whispered. "Maybe not," she said, and left him alone with the fire. That night she stood outside under the oak where the mistress was buried. The wind tore at her shawl. In her hand she held the copied letter, edges damp with rain. She imagined dropping it into the river, letting the secret drift away. But instead she folded it tighter. Secrets are not meant to drown. They are meant to rule. By the next morning, Caleb's health had worsened. He refused visitors. He spoke to mirrors. Once Annabelle heard him shout into the empty corridor, "Who told you?" "Who told you?" No one answered. But that night she wrote again. This time a longer note. Confession can cleanse a man if he has the courage to be seen. He found it pinned to his pillow. He didn't sleep again. Soon he began asking questions no one dared answer. Where was the servant ledger from last winter? Who had been sent away? Why did the cellar smell of earth even on dry days? Annabelle listened as he unraveled his own sanity thread by thread. Each question was a blade turning inward, and still she served him tea. Still she bowed. Still she said, "Yes, master." But now the word master no longer belonged to him. On the final night of that long wet season, lightning split the sky in two. Caleb sat in his study, staring at the box he had once hidden. He no longer had the strength to open it. He knew what waited inside. Not the letters, but judgment. Footsteps crossed the hall. He lifted his head. Annabelle stood in the doorway, candle in hand, her face calm, her eyes bright as glass. She said nothing. She didn't have to. The candle flame quivered between them, the only living thing in the room. Outside, thunder rolled like a verdict. She turned away first. He heard the soft sound of her footsteps fade down the hall, then the whisper of the lock turning in his own door. When he looked again, the box was gone. In the silence that followed, he realized the truth. The chains he had forged for others had come home to him, link by link, voice by voice, until they spoke in the tongue of the woman he had tried to forget. And somewhere in the dark corridors of Ashmere, Annabelle smiled for the first time in her life. The first frost came early that year. By dawn, the fields around Ashmere glittered white, each blade of grass stiff with ice. The air carried a silence too heavy for morning. Inside the great house, every room felt colder, though the hearth still burned. Caleb Warfield sat before the fire, wrapped in his robe, eyes fixed on the flames as if they might speak. The servants moved like ghosts, careful not to wake his anger. He no longer barked commands or cursed in the hallways. He simply watched everyone, everything, as though every glance might betray him. Annabelle passed him once, carrying linen for the upstairs rooms. He didn't speak, but his eyes followed her. When she reached the stairs, she felt his stare still pressed against her back like a hand. That night he did not come down for supper. By morning he had locked himself in the study again. For 3 days the sound of tearing paper echoed through the walls. When he finally emerged, his face was grey, his beard untrimmed, his hands trembling. He called for Annabelle. She entered without fear. The room stank of smoke and spilled ink. Half-burned letters lay in the fireplace. His eyes were wild. "Someone's playing a game with me," he said. His voice cracked. "They know about—" He stopped himself, then leaned closer. "Have you seen any strangers near the estate?" "No, sir," she said softly. "No one comes here now." He nodded as if he'd expected that answer all along. "Good," he whispered. "Good. Then it must be someone inside." He began questioning everyone. The stable boy, the cook, even the gardener who could barely speak English. By the end of the week, 2 more servants were dismissed. They left in silence, dragging their few belongings through the frost. Annabelle watched them from the window, her reflection faint in the glass beside Caleb's. He was trembling again. "Liars," he muttered. "All of them." When he turned away, she smiled faintly. His paranoia was a garden she tended carefully, watering it with small doubts, pruning it with silence. The less she said, the more he imagined. And imagination, she knew, was the cruelest form of punishment. That evening she wrote another letter. It bore no name, only a short line. "Every family hides its shame, but not every shame stays hidden." She placed it between the pages of his account ledger, knowing he would find it when he counted his losses at dawn. The next morning, she found him sitting at the desk with his head in his hands. He hadn't slept. When he looked up, his eyes were red and wet. "Do you believe in curses, Annabelle?" he asked. She paused. "I believe in memory, sir." He stared at her, confused. "What do you mean?" "Some memories don't die," she said. "They wait." Something in her voice unsettled him. He turned away, pretending to study the fire. But she knew his thoughts were no longer his own. They belonged to her now. Each fear, each suspicion, each unspoken confession. The days grew shorter. The fields froze solid, and inside the house the air thickened with dread. Caleb began drinking before noon. The bottle followed him everywhere, clinking against his cane as he walked. He muttered to himself, sometimes in prayer, sometimes in curse. Servants avoided him entirely. Only Annabelle remained near. One night, while he slept in the chair, she found the cellar key on his desk. She held it up to the candlelight, small, rusted, heavy with age. She knew what door it opened. She had seen him disappear into that place too many times to forget. Now it was her turn. The cellar smelled of damp stone and whiskey. Rats skittered through the darkness, their claws scraping over barrels and crates. She lit a candle and descended step by step, her breath trembling in the cold. At the far end, behind a curtain of cobwebs, stood an iron trunk. Inside were ledgers, sealed envelopes, and a small pouch of gold coins. But beneath them lay something far more dangerous, another bundle of letters. These were written by other hands. She read one. It was from a woman named Lydia, Caleb's sister. The handwriting was fragile, the words desperate. She spoke of sickness, guilt, and a child born of sin. Annabelle closed her eyes. So the rumor was true. She took one letter and pressed it to her chest. Then she replaced the trunk, careful not to leave a trace. When she climbed back into the hall, her candle was nearly gone. The wax dripped over her fingers, searing her skin. She didn't flinch. Some pain, she thought, was worth the mark it left. By morning she had already copied the letter onto new paper, her handwriting elegant and exact. She left the copy where the master would find it, folded beneath his breakfast tray. He opened it while she poured his tea. His face went pale. For a long time he said nothing. Then he whispered, "Where did you get this?" She looked down. "I thought it was yours, sir." He stared at her, then at the letter again. His lips trembled. "It's not possible," he said. "It was destroyed." She did not answer. He stood, grabbed the paper and threw it into the fire. But his hands shook so badly that the edge burned unevenly, half the letter still visible as the flames swallowed it. He watched until it was ash. Then he turned to her. "If you ever find another like that," he said, "bring it to me. Do you understand?" "Yes, master." But when she bowed, her eyes were smiling. That night he did not drink. He sat in the dark, watching the shadows stretch across the ceiling. Annabelle moved through the hall outside, her bare feet silent against the floor. At the door she paused. From inside she heard him speaking to someone who wasn't there. "I know what you want," he whispered. "But she doesn't know everything." "She can't," Annabelle smiled to herself. He was already unraveling. Over the next weeks he began avoiding mirrors. He claimed they whispered his name. He tore the drapes from the windows, insisting that eyes watched from the trees. He stopped writing letters altogether, afraid the ink itself was cursed. The family name that once meant power now clung to him like a disease. Neighbors came less often. Even the postman crossed himself before entering the gate. Annabelle played her part perfectly. When he shouted, she was calm. When he begged, she was silent. Each reaction was a mirror reflecting his guilt. She was the last voice he trusted, and the last he should have. One evening, as he sat by the fire, he said quietly, "I used to believe sin could be buried, that if you hid it deep enough, even God would forget." She looked at him from across the room. "And now?" He laughed, a dry, cracked sound. "Now I think sin digs its own way out." She stepped closer, her face lit by the firelight. "Maybe it just waits for someone brave enough to uncover it." Their eyes met. For a moment neither spoke. Then he whispered, "You should be careful, Annabelle. Curiosity can be dangerous," she smiled. "So can secrets." He looked away first. The next morning she found the study door locked. He stayed inside all day. By nightfall the house was shaking with his screams. Servants gathered outside the door, afraid to enter. Annabelle sent them away. She waited until the noise stopped. Then she slipped the key from the hook and opened the door herself. Caleb was on the floor, surrounded by torn papers and empty bottles. He looked up at her with bloodshot eyes. "Do you see them?" he asked. "And see who?" "The ones I buried," he whispered. "They don't stay quiet anymore." She knelt beside him. "Then maybe you should listen." He blinked at her, confused, and began to cry. For the first time she almost pitied him. Almost. She helped him to the chair, poured water into his shaking hands. As he drank, she studied the room, the letters, the ashes, the half-burned remains of the past. Every secret he destroyed only made him smaller. Every lie he told dug him deeper. And she was already holding the shovel. By the end of winter he was a ghost of himself. His skin grey, his voice brittle, his pride gone. The townsfolk said Ashmere was cursed. They were right. But not by spirits. By a woman who had learned the art of silence. On the last night before spring, Annabelle stood again at the cellar door. She unlocked it and stepped into the dark. The air was thick and wet, smelling of dust and old breath. In the far corner, a single candle burned low. The one she had left weeks ago, still alive. She placed the real letters beside it, one by one, like offerings. Then she whispered, "Rest now." She wasn't sure who she spoke to, the child, the sister, or herself. When she came back upstairs, dawn was breaking. She looked out at the frozen fields, the pale light sliding over them like a new beginning. Behind her the house groaned, its timbers creaking in the wind. Somewhere inside Caleb coughed in his sleep, a weak and broken sound. She didn't look back. By now the estate already belonged to her in all but name. The keys were still his, but the silence was hers. And silence, she had learned, was the truest form of power. Spring arrived, but the house of Ashmere did not bloom. The frost melted into mud, and the air smelled of rot instead of rebirth. Weeds climbed the garden wall where roses once grew, and the orchard lay silent except for the crows. Inside, the corridors whispered with draughts and memory. Every footstep seemed to echo twice, once in the present, once in the past. Caleb Warfield no longer ruled anything. He shuffled through the halls in the same robe he had worn all winter, the color of dust and sorrow. His eyes had sunk deep, his voice little more than a rasp. He spoke to no one but Annabelle, and even then only in fragments, as though every sentence cost him a piece of himself. Rumors had reached the town by now. They said the master had gone mad, that his wife haunted the upper floor, that the old slave woman and the quiet one was a witch. People swore that at night the house flickered with blue light, as if lit from within by spirits. None of them dared come close enough to see the truth. Inside, Annabelle moved like smoke through the rooms. She cleaned, she tended, she waited. Her calmness was beginning to frighten the servants, more than the master's rage ever had. Even the bravest avoided her eyes. She carried herself with the poise of someone who no longer asked permission to exist. Caleb's relatives arrived one by one. At first out of duty, later out of greed. They gathered in the parlor with tight smiles and sharper tongues, pretending to mourn while measuring the furniture with their eyes. Annabelle served them tea and listened. Every word of gossip was another match in her pocket. At dinner, a cousin, a slick-haired man named Thomas Warfield, cleared his throat. "Caleb," he said, "the family's worried. There are stories. Perhaps it's time to hand the estate over, just until you recover." Caleb's fork froze midway to his mouth. "Recover?" he whispered. Thomas smiled politely. "From whatever this business is." The letters. The strange talk. The room went still. Annabelle poured wine into Caleb's glass, steady, silent, patient. Caleb's eyes burned. "What letters?" he asked. Thomas shrugged. "The ones you sent, of course. To half the kin in Georgia." A tremor passed through Caleb's hand. He turned toward Annabelle, but she only met his gaze with quiet concern. "I sent nothing," he said through his teeth. Thomas leaned back, amused. "Then perhaps your servant here is more educated than you think." Laughter fluttered weakly around the table. Annabelle did not move. Caleb stood, knocking his chair to the floor. "Get out," he hissed. Thomas smiled wider. "If you insist." He rose, bowed mockingly to Annabelle, and left the room. The others followed like shadows behind him. When the door closed, Caleb's strength collapsed. He gripped the mantel, breathing hard. Annabelle reached to steady him, but he pushed her away. "They're all conspiring," he said. "You hear me?" "Every one of them." "Yes, sir," she said softly. Her voice was a mirror. It reflected only what he wanted to see. That night she crept to his desk and opened the drawer. Inside lay the family seal, the same mark that had once branded her letters of servitude. She pressed it into wax on a fresh envelope. One more letter, one more spark. By the time dawn came, another rumor was already taking shape. Days later, a carriage arrived carrying Thomas Warfield again, this time not smiling. He had a paper in his hand and two men behind him. They demanded answers about a document naming Annabelle Warfield as heir to Ashmere. Caleb stared at the paper, his lips trembling. "This is forgery," he said. "A lie," Thomas gestured toward Annabelle. "Then why is her name written in your hand?" The room spun. Caleb's knees gave way. He fell against the chair, gasping. Annabelle stepped forward, voice calm. "He's unwell," she said. "He hasn't been himself for months." Her tone carried quiet authority. Even Thomas hesitated. The argument grew loud, but not for long. Caleb seized the paper, tore it to shreds, and threw it into the fire. He shouted until his voice cracked, then coughed blood into his hand. The men left soon after, unsettled by what they had seen. When the house was silent again, Caleb turned on Annabelle. "You," he said, "this is your doing." She looked at him without fear. "You think I can write like a gentleman?" She asked softly. "You think I could forge your name?" He froze. The realization that she could do exactly that was too unbearable to face. He slumped back, defeated. "Get out of my sight," he whispered. She left quietly, closing the door behind her. That was the night the dreams began. He dreamed of the child, the one no one was supposed to know existed. A boy with blue eyes standing at the foot of his bed, holding a wooden horse, the same toy he had hidden in the box years ago. In the dream, the boy said nothing. He only stared until the silence became a scream. Caleb woke drenched in sweat, his heartbeat pounding like fists against the walls. From somewhere deep in the house came the faint sound of humming, a lullaby. He stumbled through the hall, shouting, "Who's there?" No one answered. But when he reached the nursery door, the song stopped. The cradle inside was empty, rocking gently on its own. From that night forward, the line between guilt and reality dissolved. Doors opened by themselves. Footsteps echoed in rooms long abandoned. Servants fled in terror. Only Annabelle remained. When he begged her to stay, she said quietly, "Someone must keep the house from falling apart." As the weeks passed, the family's visits stopped. Letters went unanswered. Ashmere became a world unto itself, a decaying planet circling one dying sun. Caleb spent his days muttering over the fireplace, his nights pacing through corridors, searching for a child who was never coming back. Annabelle followed him sometimes, candle in hand, her face calm as marble. When he stopped, she would whisper, "You hear them too, don't you?" He'd nod, trembling. In that way, she became both witness and tormentor, savior and curse. One stormy night, he descended to the cellar again. Annabelle waited until she heard the latch close, then followed quietly. The air below was thick, heavy with the smell of mold and wine. She found him kneeling beside the trunk, the contents scattered across the floor. Letters, ribbons, the broken horse. He was whispering to them, as if they could answer. "They won't leave me alone," he said. "They want me to confess." "Then confess," she said from the shadows. He spun around. "You don't understand. They'll destroy me." She stepped closer. "You already destroyed yourself." He lunged toward her, grabbing her arm, but his strength failed. He sank to the ground, sobbing. The candlelight shook, throwing monstrous shapes against the stone. She knelt beside him, voice soft. "Everything buried rises eventually," she whispered. "Even truth." He covered his ears. "Stop it." She leaned closer. "I'm not the one speaking." When she left the cellar, she locked the door behind her. Inside, he screamed until the sound turned hoarse, until it blended with the wind and the rain and became part of the house itself. By morning, she told the remaining servants that the master had taken ill. No one questioned her. They avoided that part of the house entirely. For days, faint noises came from beneath the floor, scratching, coughing, sometimes weeping. She said nothing. She had given him the same silence he once gave her. Weeks passed. The estate grew quieter. Letters from the city came addressed to Madame Warfield, and Annabelle answered them herself, her pen moving with effortless grace. She paid wages, sold livestock, handled debts. The world accepted her signature without question. The power that once enslaved her now bent to her will. But the house was never still. At night, the candle flames bent as if to invisible breath. Footsteps paced above empty rooms. Sometimes she heard her name whispered, not by him, but by something smaller, lighter, almost innocent. She would close her eyes and listen until the sound faded into the walls. One evening, she descended to the cellar again. The air was cold and sharp. Caleb sat in the corner, his clothes ragged, his face hollow. When he saw her, he tried to stand but failed. "Why are you doing this?" he rasped. She looked down at him for a long moment. "Because no one ever believed that a slave could own anything," she said. "Now you belong to me." He bowed his head. "Please end it." She shook her head. "Not yet." Then she turned and climbed the stairs, locking the door behind her. That night the storm returned, the worst since the night she found the box. Thunder cracked like a whip across the sky. Rain poured through the gutters, and the house groaned under its weight. In her room, Annabelle sat by the window, watching lightning crawl across the fields. Each flash revealed a little more of the ruin she had inherited. She should have felt triumph. Instead, she felt only the strange, quiet ache of power, the kind that costs a soul its rest. Below, the cellar door rattled once, then went still. The next morning, when she unlocked it, Caleb Warfield was silent at last. His eyes were open, staring at nothing. The chain around his wrist had snapped. She knelt beside him and closed his eyes with her hand. "You taught me to be silent," she whispered. "Now learn what silence truly means." She left him there and walked into the light of day. The air smelled clean after the storm. For the first time the estate felt empty, not haunted, not cursed, just hers. The servants bowed when she passed. In their faces she saw fear but also recognition. They understood what she had done, even if they would never speak of it. By evening the house was quiet. Annabelle sat at the master's desk, sealing a new document with the family crest. The wax gleamed red in the lamplight. She pressed the seal gently, then lifted it, leaving the mark perfect and whole. The same mark that once meant her bondage now signed her freedom. Outside, the crows circled above the orchard, crying into the fading sun. Their voices echoed through the halls like laughter from another world. Annabelle looked toward the cellar one last time. Then she blew out the candle. Ashmere belonged to her now. Its land, its ghosts, its silence. And in that silence she finally heard peace, not forgiveness. Never forgiveness, but peace all the same. The sun rose over Ashmere with a light too clean for such a house. It poured through cracked windows and broken glass, glinting on dust like flecks of gold. For the first time in years, no one shouted orders, no whip cracked across the yard, no footsteps echoed down the hall in fear. The silence was perfect, deep, final, absolute. Annabelle stood at the top of the grand staircase, dressed not in rags but in the dark silk she found in the mistress's wardrobe. It fit her as if it had been waiting all along. The house smelled of smoke and lavender. The portraits on the walls watched her, the painted eyes of generations who would never understand what had happened here. By midday, the neighbors came. They knocked with cautious hands, bringing questions and condolences they didn't mean. The master was dead, they'd heard. Yes, she told them, in a tone that ended every inquiry before it began. He had taken ill. He had passed quietly. There would be no investigation. The doctor signed the paper without a word. Men who once looked down on her now removed their hats when she spoke. By evening, the will was rewritten, simple, clean, and impossible to dispute. The estate, the land, and every remaining asset of Caleb Warfield now belonged to Madame Annabelle Warfield. She did not smile as she read it. Victory, she discovered, had no taste. It was only quiet. The servants adjusted quickly. They worked more carefully now, eyes lowered not out of fear but reverence. Some whispered that the house itself had chosen her. Others said she had bewitched it. No one dared speak her name above a whisper. And in the evenings, when the sky bled orange and the shadows stretched long, Annabelle walked the grounds like a queen returning to her throne. But power is never clean. It stains the hands that hold it, even if the touch is gentle. At night, when she passed the cellar door, she still heard things. A soft rattle, a sigh, sometimes the faintest whisper of her own name. She never opened it again. Some doors once closed must remain that way. Weeks turned to months. Letters arrived from the Warfield kin, cautious, polite, filled with false sympathy. Each began with "Dear Madam Warfield," and each ended with some variation of "May God watch over you in your loss." She answered them all herself, her pen steady, her tone dignified. None of them suspected the truth. None dared. The estate began to change under her care. The fields grew again. The workers, freedmen and women, were paid in coin, not cruelty. They tilled the soil and rebuilt the barns. Children played where overseers once shouted. Ashmere was alive again, but not the same. It no longer belonged to the old world. It belonged to her, and yet the nights remained heavy. Sometimes she woke to the faint creak of footsteps above her, slow and deliberate, tracing the same path Caleb used to walk. Once she found the wooden horse from the cellar placed on her desk. The paint had faded completely. The eyes were blank. She didn't touch it. She simply sat and stared until morning. She told herself ghosts were just memories too loud to die. And she had many. One afternoon the lawyer came, a short, nervous man with ink-stained fingers. He bowed deeply when she entered the room. "Madam Warfield," he said, "everything is in perfect order. You are now the sole legal owner of Ashmere." She nodded. He hesitated. "There is, however, one matter. The late master's body, where shall we—" "In the ground," she said, "where all debts are buried." He blinked, unsure whether to answer. "Very good, madam." He packed his papers quickly and left without another word. That evening she sat alone in the study. The air was warm with firelight. On the desk lay the seal of the Warfields. its red wax still clinging to the metal. Beside it a thin silver chain, the one she had once worn around her wrists, polished now, gleaming faintly in the light. Two symbols of the same story. She placed them side by side. The seal had once meant ownership. The chain had once meant obedience. Now they both meant memory. She traced them with her fingertips, slowly, reverently. Everything she had been, servant, secret keeper, avenger, lived in that single gesture. Outside, rain began again. A soft, steady rhythm against the windows. It sounded almost like breathing. She rose and crossed the room, staring out into the night. The orchard swayed in the wind, branches heavy with early blossoms. For a moment she thought she saw a small figure among the trees, a child perhaps, or just a shadow shaped like one. When she blinked, it was gone. The candle flickered and she turned back to the desk. She picked up the seal and pressed it into fresh wax beside her name, Annabelle Warfield. Then she lifted the chain and placed it across the mark, as if to bind the two together. For the first time she smiled, not with joy but with understanding. Power had never been about gold or land or names. It had always been about silence. Who kept it, who broke it, and who could turn it into a weapon. Caleb Warfield had ruled through fear. She ruled through calm. And calm, she had learned, was far more terrifying. Years passed. The townspeople spoke of her with awe. They said she never aged, that she still walked the fields at dawn, her black dress trailing mist, that the slaves' descendants worshipped her name in secret, that her laughter could be heard in the orchard when storms rolled in. Ashmere became legend. Some called it cursed. Others called it redeemed. Both were true. On her final night the house was quiet again. Too quiet. She sat by the fire, wrapped in the same shawl she had worn as a servant. In her lap lay the wooden horse, worn smooth from years of waiting. She turned it in her hands, tracing its edges, and whispered, "You're free now." The fire crackled softly. Smoke curled toward the ceiling, blending with the darkness. Her eyes closed, not in sleep but in surrender. When morning came, they found her still in the chair, peaceful, composed. The chain and the seal rested on the table beside her, the wax seal broken, the metal cold. Ashmere stood silent. The servants buried her beneath the oak tree near the orchard, beside no one and nothing. On her gravestone, they carved only 4 words: the Mistress of Chains. The wind carried that name through the fields, across the river, through towns that barely remembered the Warfields at all. And when it reached the far edges of the valley, it sounded less like a name and more like a promise. They said no one escapes their chains, but she did. And when she did, the world itself learned what silence could do.